Today I'm going to finish a rebuild challenge into this diorama from Modern Toy Fair. I'm going to show you all the painting and detail work in this episode. Watch part 1 of this series to see me plan, carve, and base coat this diorama. With the base coat dry, it's time for me to dirty this up using a black wash. I chose to apply this with a foam brush and then blot it up with a paper towel. You'll notice that I'm doing this in sections, and that's because I wanted to make sure that I was doing this in manageable portions since this is such a big piece. I ended up doing this on all 3 of the walls, and I actually did multiple passes of the black wash over top because I like to do subtle layers to achieve the realism that I'm going for. And just in case you're wondering, my black wash for this project is simply black acrylic paint and water. Okay, I'm at the point in the build where I want to install the windows permanently into the diorama. So we're going to go ahead and do that. These vegetable chopping mats from Dollar Tree are what I use for my windows. And whenever I can, I stock up like crazy on these when I see them at the store because they're not always there. Luckily though, I've got plenty here to do this project. Really quick point on these Dollar Tree cutting mats. There is a textured side to these, and there's a smooth side to these. So I would say just pick if you want to glue the frames to the textured or the smooth side. I like to use the smooth side, so that's what I'm going to do. I line the 3D printed window up on the cutting mat and I mark it with a Sharpie. Then I grab my T-square and my X-Acto knife and I line it up against the edge of my cutting mat to make sure I'm getting an honest right angle cut. Using that process to pre-cut all of the window sheets. Before turning to my hot wire foam factory styro glue to spread the glue evenly as possible across the entire window frame using a scrap piece of foam. And then placing it with extra care so that I line it up perfectly. I don't want any of the cutting mat to stick out because that's going to affect the way that the window sits in the foam where we want the window inserted. And as you can see, we're looking pretty good with this first window. 1 down, 6 more to go. I like to do a dry fit of the windows before I permanently glue them in place. If I know that they're going to work as a friction fit, then I know that I have a better chance of having the glue really hold them over time. One of the reasons I didn't want to glue the windows in place is because I wanted to use my airbrush around all of the perimeter pieces of these walls, including the windows. I'm using a Vallejo mahogany brown to get an effect of dirt kind of coming up from the floor upwards on the wall pieces and around some of the areas that it would naturally accumulate, like around the garage door. Another thing I like to do when I can is to put the piece together and airbrush it as is. That way I get a nice cohesive look between the floor piece and the wall pieces. After the airbrushing and dry fitting the windows, here's how everything's looking. So far, so good. And before I do anything else, I am going to go ahead and glue all of the windows in place. Here's a look at the HVAC ductwork that I 3D modeled myself that we'll be using in this project. I modeled this little air duct and vent that is going to come down in this area right here. Ultimately, it's going to permanently be glued in here, but there are some things I need to do to fix this. There's a little bit of imperfections on this, so I'm going to sand this down as well. I don't have a ton to sand here, so I start out with sandpaper and then I move to my Ryobi rotary tool to get this edge perfect so that I can pop all the friction fit pieces together. I spray painted this off camera using a metallic Rust-Oleum paint, and this is a friction fit, so I made sure that I painted all sides of it, even though this is going to be glued together with hot wire foam factory styro glue, just because I wanted a complete paint job. Then I turned back to the hot wire foam factory styro glue to glue all these pieces together. So I have these little embellishment pieces that help sell the ductwork, and I'm gluing those on with a thin layer of this glue and then just carefully placing them an equal amount, just using the eye test, not doing any precise measurements here. I let that dry for a couple of hours, and then I broke out the airbrush to do a light coat of this Vallejo mahogany brown over top of some of the vented areas and other areas that I think dirt would accumulate. I also like to airbrush on some black from my metallic pieces, which you see me doing here to help up the realism. Now that I'm satisfied with the paint job, I'm going to go ahead and glue this down with Hotwire Foam Factory Styro Goo, but I'm also going to guide this with a T-square. Once it dries, I take the opportunity to do some wash work underneath the vented area to add some dirt and grime that might have come through the exhaust. And I also apply a little bit under the windows. Now that that's done, I'm going to do the double doors using this spray paint. I didn't show it on camera, but I also sanded this down with several different types of sandpaper, and I primed it before painting. So if you guys have ever let a PLA print or plastic print dry outside, if it's in direct sunlight, it can warp like what you see here. So I'm going to try a solution to fix this using a heat gun, but if it doesn't work, I'm going to have to either reprint this or do something else. So let's see how it goes. This is something I really should have known better about because I live in South Carolina. It's the middle of summer. Normally, though, the problem is that it was in direct sunlight. If it was in indirect sunlight, this probably wouldn't have been an issue. My thought process here was putting it down in the area I wanted it to melt to, while using the heat gun after having the glue would let it set in place, and then pushing it down with some foam scraps. Okay, so it did work, but I was not super careful and it melted the foam a little bit around the edge of this. But I actually think it kind of looks good in the setting of like a messed up, dirty old warehouse. And if anything, I could cover this up if the client wants me to. I did check with the client, Modern Toy Fair, and he actually liked this and thought it was an enhancement, so it was kind of a happy accident and all's well. So similar to what I did with the air duct, now I'm going to go ahead and use the airbrush to weather this up, first with the mahogany brown to darken this up around the door and the frames, paying specific attention to some of the edging and the door handles and things of that nature. Here's a better look at some of that detail work. I'm trying to dispense a little bit of paint at a time because I don't want to overdo it and have a big splotch on top of my door. I want it to look realistic, like this is an old warehouse door that's been used quite a bit. And then I did go back in there with the Vallejo black and also added some more dirt and grime and really enhanced the door handles on this step. There's still some edging work that I need to do for the warehouse, so I'm using my Proxxon to cut out some foam pieces for that. Just to give myself a rough idea of the trim work that I want to do right underneath the windows here, I went ahead and laid down the Proxxon cut beams that I'm going to use for this, and you can see that I still need to cut some of the excess here on each side. But I'm just trying to get an idea of where everything lines up. And another thing I'm going to have to do is cut these side pieces so that cut these so that this butts up directly against that on both sides. So I'm going to try to go ahead and get that done. So I was able to do what I was talking about. So now there's like a true corner, and this is just going to be up on the top here. I just have it on the bottom just to give me an idea. But I have a true corner on each side. Now I just have to trim down these edges, and then we're going to start texturing and painting those pieces before we glue them in place. And if you're familiar with the channel, you know that I'm using a ball of tinfoil to texture these pieces. It's probably also no surprise that I'm using Hotwire Foam Factory Styro Goo to glue them. Or that I'm using acrylic paints by Anita's to paint this up with the base coat of gray. Here's how they look as they're drying before we glue them on. For this portion of the project, I really wanted to be careful to make sure that everything lined up. So I wanted to make sure I got a good tack on this glue, and that's why I always use my scrap piece to adhere that to the piece. And I had to take extra care here because I had two different pieces to line up. The trim work on the original diorama that I'm recreating didn't have as clean of trim work as I wanted it to. But I'm very happy to report that this one is nearly perfect. Really happy with the way that this all came out. Everything is lining up exactly the way that I want it. Off camera, I modeled a series of 3D printed parts that are going to be used, like these light fixture covers that I'm going to place over the door, the garage door light cover, which is the same thing but just a larger version that's going to go right over the garage and house those lights. and also some really cool utility box designs that are a first for this project. I sanded these down and primed them and was able to get what I think looks like a pretty good metallic finish for sort of metal utility boxes. This one is actually not painted yet. I'll get to that though. Quickly, I'll use this metallic silver to paint up the light fixtures. So the next thing that I'm going to do is prepare the diorama for wired lighting. So I have these mega LED lights from Evans Designs Lighting. And I also have some of these power packs that I'm going to hook up using some shrink tube and a little bit of heat. But the first thing that I have to do is puncture holes in the spots that I want the lights to come through in. And then we're going to install the fixtures. I'm using a handheld hot wire tool to puncture the holes in the walls. And then I just want to ensure that the lights are actually going to fit through. So I put them through all of the holes that I just punctured to test that out. Okay, so now I have the little LEDs put in here, and they're not glued in yet. I am going to apply some glue around where the hole is and stick these on with that glue. And then once all of the light fixtures are ready, I'm going to place them like this, and you won't be able to see them. They're going to have a covering on the bottom like that, so that they'll kind of look really cool in place, and they can distribute light downwards. Off camera, I used the same vegetable cutting mats that I used on the windows and pre-cut those to the different sizes of my light fixtures. Then I used some glue and applied it with a Q-tip to spread it evenly before gluing on those little vegetable mat pieces. Okay, so I've taken some twist ties, I've cut them into pieces, and I glued them over top of the wires just to make sure that the wire and the light itself doesn't move. So that's what this side looks like. And then let's test out how this light is going to be distributed on the front side of the diorama. So here's what it looks like with just the light without the fixture on it. I want to make sure that the fixture actually reflects the light down so it looks more realistic. So let's just see how that looks when we put that over top. To me, that looks great. I think that's going to be a very believable kind of effect with the light fixture shining down the light over top the door in all these different areas. Then it was time to glue. Used the same glue that I've been using this whole project, and I glued it over top of the door frame. And I really love this stuff. It does not take long to tack up, as you guys can see, and the lighting is looking awesome. And I'm personally really excited to see how the big light over the garage looks. I'm using the same exact process I just showed you with the glue and the Q-tip to get this in place. I decided to mount my power supplies with Velcro strips, which is very similar to what I did on my RPD station build. Watch that video for a full breakdown. Next up is the very important step of wiring the lighting. Before I actually do the wiring, I always test that the power supplies and the lights work, because if you do the whole process without doing that, you can be very frustrated if they don't end up working. But basically, you just match the colors together, tighten the wires around each other, and then place the heat shrink over top of them and melt it down using a heat source. I chose a lighter, but you could also use a heat gun or a hairdryer or anything like that. Here's how it looks with all of the wired lighting installed and functional. I'm so excited to see how Modern Toy Fair uses these in his ACBA setups. I also painted up the light fixtures so they would not look brand new. At this point, we're getting really close to the end of the build. I just need to install the 3D printed utility boxes that I designed. I'm going to be gluing these permanently in place. I have an idea of where I want them to be, so I start out with sort of my accessory pipe or my electric power pipe, and then I move on to the main utility box, which is this little dark gray one that I created. And then I decide to glue on the bigger box and a connector piece to kind of make it look like these two have a shared power source. My original plan was to put all of the utility boxes on the same wall, but I kind of rethought it and I wanted to have some over here by the garage door. So I have two identical boxes and then two identical little power strips that are meant to look like they're connecting the power supply of the boxes. I think doing it this way makes it more visually interesting. And it looks like Spider-Man and Captain America agree. But seriously, I wanted to get some legends in here so you could see how these size up height-wise from Marvel Legends. So personally, I think these beams look a little bit too clean right now because I haven't done any washes or anything on them. So we're going to go ahead and use the Vallejo paint that we did some airbrushing with, and we're going to do some watered down washes of those. Whenever I do washes, I do them in a really watered down way so that I can apply subtle layers of my washes over time, just to make sure that I don't mess things up when I'm trying to apply it. I don't want it to appear too heavy-handed, so that's kind of my approach with washes. The absolute last thing that I do is dry brush the fixtures, and I think this is fitting because the first piece was completely dry brushed, and this one, showing my improvement, shows that I don't rely as heavily on that skill 3 years later. Alright, so here's the final version of the new diorama versus the final version of the old diorama, and I hope that you guys think that this one is much improved after seeing the entire process. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope that you will subscribe to the channel after watching this whole series. Thank you so much. I will see you in the next episode.
Vasco Toys. Action figure dioramas and props.